Control is contact. The Process Church of the Final Judgment, London. December 1969. Communication to all brethren, information. Brethren, as it is. Control is contact. On a purely physical level, the more in contact we are with something, the better and more efficiently we can control our operation of it. The more solid the contact, the more precise the contact, the more complete the contact, the better the control.
This is Interzone Analysis with another episode of Insight Analytica, part 2 on the Process Church of the Final Judgment. What you just heard there was another recording of a BI or Brethren information communication from the Process Church of the Final Judgment, put out from London, Thursday the 4th of December 1969. Control is contact. Like in the first episode, I started off with a recording of their communications. For that is how I initially got to find out what the process was actually about, beyond the sensational nature of academic and investigative journalistic work on the subject from the 60s and 70s, and also the later mostly chaos magician reincorporated process and ex-processians information books and films and documentaries, which are heavily biased also towards legitimizing the process in a sense, which defeats the purpose of the process, because the process is all about not becoming part of what they call the grey forces. The grey forces is essentially... So the grey forces are essentially Robert de Grimston's version of what you would call now NPCs, normies. As Robert de Grimston writes, essentially that the real devil is humanity. Well, he has a literal one of the main core de Grimston writing is humanity is the devil. And so the grey forces essentially are composed of conformity, typical of the masses. And so people that think that NPCs and all these ideas are new, nothing's new, all this stuff comes from counterculture going back and back and back. Now, in this episode, the first episode, I laid out a basic timeline of the process, also utilizing a bit of an explanation of the Omega, Robert de Grimston and Marianne, and also their associations with certain people and the infamy. But in this episode, I will be going further into what the process is actually all about and what they believe. And there's a bit of confusion, I realize, because of people like Genesis P. Orange and the Temple of Psychic Youth and a lot of 90s chaos magic culture adopting elements of Processian material or co-opting it and because of their kind of association with more hippie, less transgressive ideologies within occult movements, particularly Temple of Psychic Youth, yeah, they were transgressive in many ways, but people seem to conflate them with the process, and there's a lot of confusion because of all these different pairings and separations and splinters, and which is what I'm trying to deconstruct into simplest form, like I have done with other organizations, like the other infamous, quote, Satanic organization from originating in the United Kingdom, the Order of Nine Angles. I will go back to the early core material rather than what came later to give a better overview. But like with the LNA, I will still be focusing heavily on what happened, the fractures within the movements and the chaos that then ensued, and why all these people like Manson and Son of Sam and Mick Jagger and the Beatles even, which is a sort of inside joke with processians, that the Beatles are associated with the process. However, a lot of the time with esoteric groups, sometimes there is elements of truth within these little bits of japes, to use certain organizations' terminology. Now, because I tend to focus better on the overall operational, organizational praxis of complex splinter cell organizations, rather than the esoteric elements themselves. And just like with the Order of Nine Angles being hijacked by other movements, so has the process, which has created massive amounts of confusion. However, I will go into some basic elements of their belief system. Now, as people know from the first episode, the process came from Robert de Grimston and Marianne, who, like all brilliant people of the 60s, were associated with Scientology. Well, not associated, they were in Scientology in the early 60s. And they were both, she was Marianne, an ex-escort, was an auditor, so using the E-meter to go through psychological and traumatic breaks in people and help find those breaks. The E-meter is essentially, people talk down the E-meter because they say it only goes by the sweat in the hands, etc. No, it's more complicated than that. The E-meter is an absolutely genius machine, and so what they were doing, Robert Grimston and Marianne, where they were deviating from Hubbard's methods of getting through these blockages to eventually go clear, in Scientology terminology, and experimenting with it. And then they ran away they were declared SPs, suppressive persons, within Scientology, because they created their own group as they started to bring in more esoteric elements like God, and using the E-meter in extremely transgressive ways. And then they created their own group that eventually became the process from compulsions analysis. Someone asked me a question about the e-meter on YouTube that I will very briefly go into, and I will answer this question properly in time because this is something very in-depth, and I believe it's important to bring up. At GLXTCHEDOTR, also thank you for asking this brilliant question. I appreciate it a lot. No problem, man. I really enjoy your insights. One question I do have, I was under the belief that the E-machines were bunk, not real, or basically measured the sweat in your hands. Is this misinformation? Your interest in actually having one made me think I'm missing something. You don't seem like one to go into something without some knowledge on it. Respectfully, peace. Now, simplicity is key. And the e-meter simplifies elements of the lie detector machine. And given most intelligence in the US after World War II came out of the Navy, essentially. It's different than Australia, the UK, and many other countries. A lot of the clandestine operation stuff, which was cooperated in CIA, I won't go into that all right now, but L. Ron Hubbard being in the Navy, and unlike what the documentary and the book Going Clear says, Hubbard was not a complete fuck-up in the Navy. I mean, he wasn't distinguished either, but it was blatant bias and propaganda, not with regards to some elements in that. And Hubbard was an absolute genius, utilizing the e-meter as... to answer your question, it doesn't matter if the machine does anything at all, as long as that little dial is moving and the person believes that... And remember, this is in the late 50s, Dianetics. And I had a lot of brilliant people in my youth who they are never Scientologists, that they read Dianetics. They were very interested in this, and to understand the process, you have to understand Scientology to some extent. And to understand Manson and the connections to the process, you have to understand Scientology. You have to understand Scientology to understand the entire occult. And cult movements outside of Christian pedophile cults in the US and hippie cult compounds, but to actually understand the late 60s and to the late 70s occult revival that happened. There is of major importance in understanding the process Church of the Final Judgment, because after Aleister Crowley died in the 40s, everything went into a state of flux in ceremonial magic, the Western esoteric tradition, and people hoarded material from Crowley, from the AA, from the OTO, from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, etc. And it wasn't until it was mass published openly for the first time, because the Equinox, which was mass published in the early 1900s by Crowley, which a whole court case came out of Golden Dawn rituals and material, that was There were very few editions around. That was very old by the 50s and 60s. So during the early 60s, there was very little information on the occult in the West because all the organizations had fallen apart. The OTO, which L. Ron Hubbard was a member of, he wasn't just a member, he was involved way above his degree within the Ordo Templi Orientis, because Jack Parsons, who ran the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and has a crater on the moon named after him, Jack Parsons became friends with L. Ron Hubbard through the natural interest in science fiction, and they did secret rituals together, and Jack Parsons ran the California Lodge of the OTO in the post-World War II period. And remember, during World War II, you're American, you couldn't fucking travel. You couldn't go to Europe, and as a backpacker, for fuck's sake. It was, if you didn't go to war as a soldier, you were not leaving America during World War II. Where the fuck would you go? Unless you were involved in intelligence, espionage, or, the military. You were stuck in America. So Parsons, all these people, Hubbard was an incredibly charismatic person. He had been all over the world as a naval officer. So suddenly there's somebody who's actually worldly and actually has been to places. So Parsons been, they befriended each other, and he was essentially initiated through Parsons, way above what, because the degrees don't fucking matter. The initiations matter, yeah, but it's what they did together was something massively significant, and the OTO had a huge impact on, but also on L. Ron Hubbard, and also L. Ron Hubbard's obvious involvement in some form of intelligence, tradecraft, through the operational strategic services during World War II. Because there's something going on with Hubbard, because his understanding of neurolinguistics and his understanding of psychology. Yeah, he was a con man, but he was an absolute genius in what he did. And the organizational structure, the operational practice, everything that L. Ron Hubbard did. And Dianetics works. The problem Hubbard came up with is when he turned it into a religion, Hubbard was faced with, where do you go beyond using a machine to essentially it does work as a lie detector, because the person involved is being literally, it's called auditing for a fucking reason. They're being like a tax audit, which is, you're under psychological pressure you're being interrogated. You're auditing, not to a psychologist. You're going there to be interrogated, to find traumatic blocks, to then have those removed. It's when you, and they do this for your life, but then also past lives later down the line. So going clear, you get rid of all your blockages. Now, William S. Burroughs, one of my favorite authors, was also a Scientologist for a decade. And he was clear. So that's a huge amount of time. And it's a fantastic book on William S. Burroughs' involvement in esotericism, specifically Scientology. And I forget the name of it, but I highly recommend reading it, because Burroughs shows up as an important element within the process, both during the 60s and 70s, and then later in the 90s with the Chaos Magician community in America with Genesis P. Orange, Temple of Psychic Youth crowd. So Yeah, it is more complex. The e-meters have changed since the original, but even the original, it's not just the sweat. It can detect it, because people who go under anxiety don't just. Some people don't have an increase in perspiration. You can pass lie detector tests. Psychopaths almost always pass lie detector tests because they have absolutely. I've gone in this in a episode on psychopaths because they have absolutely no. Their arrogance, along with their complete lack of activity in the prefrontal cortex, they can just bathe like a lizard, essentially, because they run from the amygdala, the brainstem, the reptilian complex of the mind. They don't fold under the normal psychological pressures. You have to set them up to fail because psychopaths are usually cowards. It's quite easy to do so, but they're absolutely brilliant at getting through this kind of interrogation technique because of their arrogance that they will beat the test. They are a useful tool, but one that is, for the context of law enforcement, highly unrecommended for especially sexual sadistic psychopathic personality types and career criminals, because if you can handle yourself under intense pressure, you can calm. It's like when you go shooting. If anyone has gone shooting for the purposes of sports shooting, not talking about hunting, I'm talking about shooting with rifles, bolt action rifles, usually like a 22. You slow your you can slow your pulse, essentially, your blood. You can slow your per minute down. You can do this in the context of a conversation with somebody without them knowing. If you know how to use certain body language, and this is all part of what's called human intelligence, and interrogation is a massive part of it. And it's something that I'm very interested in for both professional and personal reasons. But yeah, the e-meter, you're under a significant pressure, especially back then, where you don't know what this machine is that you're hooked up to, and this person is all of a sudden asking very, very harsh and questions that elicit, deliberately designed to elicit a psychological response, because Scientologists and auditors in particular in Scientology, and they are interrogators. They are trained in using human intelligence techniques. I know this too because when I was a teenager, I decided to go to the Scientology Center in my city to pretend to want to become a Scientologist. And I dragged a stoner friend of mine, and I also dragged another stoner who he was selling weed to. I was not a stoner. I was doing this as an experiment. And I went, wouldn't it, guys, it would be so fun if we pretend to go and become Scientologists, because it's a 300 question interrogation that they do essentially back then to you. And what they did in the center was they clocked us in 2 seconds, or where essentially they could tell my two friends were, well, the other guy wasn't my friend, but one was an obvious drug dealer and stoner, the other was a really, he was a really sad guy. We were all very young, by the way, when we did this. And I was a completely different character. So they brought in 2 guys to talk to them, and then they brought an incredibly attractive young woman to talk to me. This was deliberate. It wasn't who they just randomly had in the office. They chose these people, and this is what the process does. This is what all these groups do when they get in prospective members. They knew that I was an arrogant little shit who was coming in going, I'm going to just absolutely fuck with you Scientologists because I've taken too much Dexedrine and I'm bored. And I am a 17-year-old idiot. And I've dragged my 2 stoner friends, but in 2 seconds they could tell that I was doing. They could, but they knew they could easily sway me and the others by using just really basic techniques. So with me, they went, okay, this guy is obviously dragged these 2 guys with him to not look as suspicious. These 2 guys have very different demeanors and dispositions to him. These 2 guys need father figures. This guy is very arrogant. He is, if we bring in a incredibly beautiful woman, which is what cults do all the time, especially for people like me at that age, because, and this is what the process did, this is what all of them do, because they become masters of basic profiling, using FBI terminology, or human intelligence, or clocking someone in street terms. You can see the potential in all these individuals to a certain extent of what the organization will get from them. And with the 2 stoners, you could probably get them into the Sea Org. You give them a father figure, maybe, and get them off drugs. The process had the same idea, except they used their drug magazine to get drug dealers to then get the ones, to then connect them with celebrities to sell coke to, which was a bit more difficult to find in the late 60s in America than it was in the 70s. To people like David Bowie, and the Manson family were also drug dealers, and methadone crystal dealers too. And the connection, the whole Roman Polanski Quaalude things. Who the fuck do you think was selling the Quaaludes, and how do they know, and why Polanski and Sharon Tate? It's because it was an open door, and Polanski was using Quaaludes sold by Scientologists and Processians to go and sexually assault teenage girls. Because having drug dealers is very, very useful, very useful. And these organizations think incredibly cynically because they're all very, very, very similar to the intelligence services and how they operate. Because the majority are ex-intelligence. The same with most occult and esoteric movements. Even the fucking Temple of Set, ex-naval intelligence officer, I keep forgetting his name, he looks like Spock. And milquetoast Satanism, but still, all these connections. But the reason I bring up this story is this is what the process does. This is what they all do, and this is why Scientology is important in all this. So with them, they use the father figure lacking, and to get them off drugs. With me, they used taking me by surprise with an incredibly beautiful girl who was not much older than me. And so they played off my ego and my pride and me wanting to, fuck her. Very easy way to get me into Scientology. When you're 17 and you've obviously got some form of potential that they see. The other two, most likely, get them to sign a $6 billion year contract and get them into the Sea Org. No, that's not fair with my friend. They would have found a use for him. But we went through the whole process, you see, and after a couple of hours, came out, and I wasn't particularly impressed because she essentially called me a psychopath. Well, not essentially. She said I was a psychopath and that I needed to become a Scientologist so I wouldn't be a psychopath. Here's, of course, blah, blah, blah. And then tried to kind of... Because I pathologically lied my way through the entire thing, and it was obvious that I was on amphetamines. And have you ever done drugs? Oh no, of course not. Have you ever done it? Of course not. So, but they played my two friends, both of them, even the drug dealer, who was a much more street smart 17-year-old compared to the other guy. They both were completely taken in because they use these two guys in their 40s to be these sort of cooler father figures. The drug dealer friend of mine, his father, he was fatherless. He was a bastard. He didn't know who his father was. I don't know the other kid's story, but they were both lost teenagers. I wasn't. I was, but I was a bit more complex to clock. So they went by base instinct, desire, lust, which was harder to correlate into getting me in because they weren't offering outright sex and giving you a girlfriend like the Moonies. Process would take it that far. They wouldn't even sleep. Processians, they would stand out in the streets and work for days on end because they were fueled by amphetamine. So yeah, when they interrogated me, essentially, and this is before the cringy bullshit with 4chan and anonymous protesting Scientology. So this is before that happened, so you were actually able to get access to Scientology and show up as an idiot 17-year-old with two stoned friends. But they got them in instantly. I had to wait for like half an hour, 45 minutes in a room by myself. Another technique that is utilized in interrogation within the intelligence services and also the police forces, where they make you wait and wait and wait to try and wear you down a little bit, and it puts you in a... But they didn't do it for that purpose. They did it because they needed to get a girl that was age appropriate in, i.e. around 20, who was obviously a fucking auditor, because they knew the daddy thing was not going to work with me. I was a whole different kind of animal. They needed to get in the attractive young girl to flirt with me and to bring the... And I had just, I think, broken up with some girl with if my friend who was a drug dealer back then is listening, sorry, I'm not saying that you're I'm sorry for using you for my social experiments. You were a good friend. But I chose you and the other guy because I knew they would clock you both in 2 seconds. And I had already had murder charges thrown at me as a teenager over some stupid bullshit I had nothing to do with police interrogation. So I'd gotten used to this kind of being under intense fucking pressure. Not charges, but being dragged in and accused and all that shit. Anyway, I bring up that story because this is how cults work. You know, the mistake that they made with me, because because they chose a girl who would sexually initiate me, and you know, I was attracted to men of power and who can, you know, playing completely on my ego and then throwing in questions that deliberately cause disassociation to try and slip you up. So suddenly going from stroking my ego to, and you know, flirting with me to, you're on drugs, aren't you? You're a drug addict. Which I was. I was on speed, but I was actually a morphine addict during that period as a teenager. It didn't throw me off, but it snaps you into this kind of state where it's much easier to... Criminals do this too when they suddenly flip on you after being very friendly and then go back to normal. It's a bombardment. There's specific terminology for it. I won't go into. The process do this. They all do this. Cults do this. But in particular, Scientology and the splinter groups, like the Process Church of the Final Judgment that came out of Scientology, all utilize classic interrogation, human intelligence techniques developed and perfected by these cults, many of which, as I've mentioned, are completely linked to the intelligence services. How the fuck do you think they move around so much? Because they need people, the intelligence services need people who can move around as excuses to move agents, well, agents is the wrong word, to move intelligence officers. So they make deals with cults and groups like Scientology, but you know, they make deals with the process to help move intelligence officers to certain chapters in Europe as an excuse to get intelligence officers into other countries to perform, covert or clandestine intelligence operations. They also use cults as a means of funding clandestine intelligence operations. And there's a reason why the south of France is full of cults, why Switzerland. And another cult I'll definitely be going into in the future, which was in Switzerland, and also like the Process Church of the Final Judgment, much came out of ceremonial magic, is no exception to this rule. Even J. Edgar Hoover was a anointed bishop for the Orthodox Catholic Church of America or something. A completely fake church created by the FBI to move agents. I don't know why they utilize the terminology agent in the FBI rather than an intelligence officer or operational officer, or they use different. An agent is an asset. An agent is somebody who is used by intelligence officers to gather information. They are an informant. They are a piece of shit, essentially. I don't know why they utilize that terminology where the rest of the world doesn't, but that's an American thing. But yeah, to move their intelligence officers into different countries. The OTO is no different with the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, or whatever it's fucking called, the Gnostic Mass, where you have to have an ordained bishop. And as OTO, lodges, oases all over the world. As long as you know the correct I'll just call them passwords. You can go to any lodge, any oasis, anywhere in the world and gain entrance, essentially. But the bishops, a lot of them are spooks. So the only reason I didn't end up in Scientology is they made the mistake of getting the girl away, and then because they play shit safer now, which is why it's boring. In the old days, they would have used the girl to get me in to be an auditor, essentially, to get other people in, because they could see I was already utilizing leadership qualities that would be very useful in recruiting people, essentially. Like they have, because they're a religion, they have to now go by, and this is what's destroyed secret societies from being transgressive, like the OTO, is they are now under accountability laws, essentially. So they can't do, they're under public health and safety laws. They can't do anything that transgressive anymore, especially in the lower end. So people like myself who are attracted to things that are transgressive are no longer as welcome. And this is a big problem. You need transgressive movements, and that's a whole subject for another time. So I brought up the e-meter, as without Scientology, and this is how the process became so powerful, and why, because they utilized all these kind of techniques. However, there was no accountability or public health and safety with the process. They didn't give a shit. If that was a processian, and this was the late 60s, or early to mid to late 70s, that girl would most likely have been used to fuck me and get me in, and then I'll be wearing a black robe, handing out process magazines on dexedrine or methadone crystal, staying awake 3 days in the street in California or New York, handing out leaflets to the grey forces, getting annoyed at me like a Harvey Krishna. But, and this is why the process is the one cult that I would join, or would have joined, is they were actually cool. They were actually transgressive and hardcore. Now, you have to understand, to even understand the basic operational, the basic techniques used in the process that are the foundation of their belief system. You have to understand Scientology to a certain extent, and to understand that Scientology had to explain the interrogation process, the e-meters, to some extent. So the e-meters don't matter that much. They just, imagine going through 300 question interrogations where they deliberately put somebody in who they're using because they know that it's going to elicit a certain response, like a father figure for the two guys that needed the father figure, or an attractive woman, in my case, because of the egotistical, narcissistic, or psychopathic personality archetype that they utilized when clocking me instantly. However, that was just the teenage idiot self. But it's... imagine having that and sitting there with a fucking e-meter in the 60s or 70s where you have no idea what this machine is, and you see it go whenever you start getting a little bit stressed. When they hit you with the disassociation, the e-meter will go, oh, there's a blockage there. Now, the process got rid of the e-meters, but they were utilized in the foundation of creating their entire system. Their system is sex, the gods, and the grey forces. I'm quoting from a picture encapsulating it, what Processian belief is. 3 paths in a quagmire, the game of the gods. Who is strong enough to follow one of the paths? Who is fool enough to fall into the quagmire? The grey forces hold away, but the gods are returned to recruit their armies for the end. The pendulum swings, 3 paths in a quagmire. On the following pages, an advocate puts the case for each. Now, if you notice something, just in this little paragraph, there is a lot of repetition. Because everything process related, especially by Robert de Grimston, you will notice that the repetition of things again and again and again and again and again. He's using fantastic levels of linguistic programming and human intelligence techniques. This is all stuff back then you could only really get a hold of if you knew spooks, essentially. You know, he's repeating and so the picture shows, in a sense, of the game of the gods, and there's Lucifer, Jehovah, and Satan. Now, to give a basic outline of the belief system, when it came together after, and that's why I went into Scientology and adding a bit of my experience into the auditing techniques. Even though I wasn't being audited, it was a interrogation essentially, but they use this in compulsions analysis to then, after the hurricane that I mentioned, when they moved to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, they had a fundamental theological purpose that came from a direct contact with the gods that the members experienced during the hurricane. It had a massive psychedelic experience, which changed everything. And this is when things started to drift away from the more archetypal into an ideology that developed from de Grimston's interpretation of the 3 basic forces, which he designated as God, which is Lucifer, Satan, and which was what I mentioned before, Jehovah, Satan, and Lucifer. However, Lucifer and Satan and Christ were presented as the unification principle of this. The divergent energies, because Satan was included amongst these primordial energies. I'm reading from some Processian material. It was easily and purposely misconstrued by those who had accused the process of being involved in Satanism and animal sacrifice. Okay, that's the wrong part, but here we go to this satanic panic stuff again. However, no, they were involved in it was Satanism. They're more satanic than the Church of Satan ever was. So these four gods of the process represent basic underlying personality archetypes, which at their core can be observed to four distinct and unique attributes through some process members treated them as actually existing in non-corporeal sense. Others conceive them as theoretical archetypes, a combination of which makes up the human psyche. By properly understanding the subconscious, the drives and desires that are motivated through the interaction of the gods, man may come to realize the structures that control our behavior and attain to the aspirations of one's higher self. Each individual leans more to one particular god, although all four are present in the self to varying degrees. Jehovah represents strength. He is the wrathful God of vengeance and retribution. He demands discipline, courage, ruthlessness, and a single-minded dedication to duty, purity, and self-denial. Lucifer, the light-bearer, urges us to enjoy life to the fullest, to value success in human terms, and to be gentle, kind, and loving, and to live in peace and harmony with one another. This defines the ethos which characterized the 60s into the 70s generation. Lucifer has always held a special occult significance within magic and secret societies. Lucifer being a Roman god, and the brother of the goddess Diana. Lucifer is also in the Bible through a mistranslation of the King James Bible from Hebrew or something. And then there's the esoteric Lucifer, which is from the Theosophy and Blavatsky. Anyway, and Nazi occultism and Freemasonry have all recognized the primary influence of the mythological role of Lucifer. He is exemplified by an awareness of the physical aesthetics of beauty and body image, hedonistic indulgences, free will, and material success in Lucifer Rising, which is a film by Kenneth Anger, which I won't go into now. As I said, I'm letting a Processian explain this better than I can. So that's the swastika symbol represents the four god archetypes that you see in the process. And so then you go to Satan. Satan represented separation and was perceived as an adversary. He is the receiver of transcended souls and corrupted bodies. He instills in us directly opposite qualities at one end and urge to rise above all human and physical needs and appetites, to be all soul and nobody at the other end, to sink beneath all human codes of behavior and wallow in the morass of violent lunacy and excess of physical indulgence. Christ is the unifier and is the emissary of the gods. He plays a pivotal role in the salvation of humanity through his task of unifying the universe. He is the reconciler of opposites and a transcender of conflict. Many rituals were devised to bring process members into communion with each of these gods. It played a major importance for Processians to realize that they were subject to the will of the gods. Several books play an especially important role in conveying the message of the process. Exit is a book of teachings. Exit, by the way, is at the very beginning of this podcast, and the first one is a Microsoft computer voice-generated recording of exit, which is initially, which was the only a series of letters which were called Brother and Information, and that was the first actual processed material I ever got to hear that was from the original process, because I didn't have any text of it, but a processean uploaded videos with Microsoft Sam reading out, the BIs, and I started to realize there is something in this that's absolutely genius in its simplicity. Because you got to remember, de Grimston and Marianne and Timothy Wiley and other people in the UK had a bit more access to occult manuscripts. Second-hand bookshops would still have, but within the AA secret society that Crawley ran, and the OTO, which was in a state of absolute chaos during this period, a guy was hoarding all of Crawley's material and the Golden Dawn's material, and all this stuff wasn't published properly until really the 70s, which created the occult revival, which Kenneth Grant goes into, who is a subject for another time. But there's very little other than, compared to now, where you can go and read everything. The Israel Regardie publishing the Equinox, Gems of the Equinox, and the Golden Dawn, and we have access to everything. However, I will say there are still secrets. There are still secrets within some of these secret societies that are not made public and that have not been published on the internet. Very few, but they do exist. Anyway, back then, they had to simplify things to an extent, because even getting Rider-Waite tarot deck wasn't exactly the easiest thing back then. But in the UK, you had more access because most of these societies that had major influence later, once more, came out of the UK. So people like de Grimston, who had connections with the London School of Economics, and they got a little bit more access to this stuff. And that's why Scientology in the 60s was such a big fucking deal, and why people like Burroughs, who you would think would be in the Ordo Templi Orientis or something, became a fanatical Scientologist. Because there were, in Tangier, there was International Zone, the Interzone in Tangier, I think, which is what the book and the International Zone, where a lot of Nazis were hiding at that time after Burroughs accidentally killed his wife. There was a Scientology center there, this in the 60s, I believe, because Brian, anyway, Bart Burroughs was going to London too, there were Scientology centers. The point being, Scientology gave you access to stuff when the OTO was not really existing, and people were hoarding Crawley's material because they wanted to make money publishing it. So everything was in flux until the occult revival. So the simplification of things through things like Scientology and using Jungian depth analysis archetype representations, and it's absolutely genius during a period where you're dealing with they unlike now, they actually had to experiment because they didn't have the path laid out for them, they had to join collectives, groups. Otherwise, and cults. If you wanted any form of gnosis and esoteric knowledge, and the majority of people are not in Oxford or Cambridge to be connected to remnants of the AA and other groups during that time. So after this hurricane that I mentioned at the time on the Yucatan Peninsula, this was when the apocalyptic Austin Osman Spare style mix of Scientology fucking and they deliberately using archetypes that everybody knows back then too. You see, everything about the process is making it simple enough for the methadone dealer you want to, or the coke dealer to sell coke to Bowie, and also the intellectual who's read, pardon me, Jung and a lot of esoteric material available, stayed in places like Finhorn, and done. And like with anything, you can kind of get as much or as little out of it as you want. And because of the lack of time that most Processians had, it was a collective. They were literally staying awake for days. They were on the streets trying to recruit the grey forces. But part of the point of why they were called from the process to the process church of the final judgment is this apocalyptic unification of Christ and Satan was because of the Vietnam War, because of the chaos of the 60s, which was not a pleasant period to be in. The 60s was an absolute nightmare if you actually lived through it. And you weren't, one of the boomers that were in a position of actually being able to enjoy the 60s to a certain extent. People who had to go through the ringer in the 60s, Vietnam, conscription, all this shit. It's not... and the Cold War. The 60s was not exactly... and the early 70s. It's not a pleasant period. I mean, my father was all over the place in the 60s. I can't even really track where he was. He was it was gone from 68 to 70, God knows where, won't tell me. And then he was in Russia, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Serbia, Yugoslavia. And then in Canada. So his whereabouts from 68 to 74 are pretty much I cannot verify, other than he seems to have been in every Eastern Bloc communist country. Dad, I know you're a spook, for fuck's sake. You hung up with Che Guevara's brother in Canada in the 70s, taking speed and LSD. Why were you there, Dad? And why were you... It's because they needed people to keep tabs. Sorry if I've blown your cover, or if you're the Forrest Gump of the intelligence world, Dad, I'm sorry. If you just happen to be everywhere possible. I come from a very strange background. Anyway, which is why I love intelligence tradecraft in the process and things like this. So the game of the gods, it explains the role of Satan, and this is where things really got interesting because the process started to their magazines, their literature, the apocalyptic nature of it was so different and distinct, and them wearing these black robes with these swastika symbols is fucking terrifying compared to the hippie, lame, stupid bullshit that you get. I'm sorry, I just absolutely despise the I love elements of hippie culture, don't get me wrong, with regards to certain with music and things like that, but it's not hardcore enough for me. But the process is, even though processians like to water it down a little bit, and chaos magicians like to make it a little bit lamer than it is, they were fucking hardcore and created the satanic panic. Going to America and using Lucifer and Satan as major archetypes, it would have been the conservative Christians would have freaked out with processians, which is why they moved around a lot. But they and also because reasons I'll go into later, and I'll go into the coffee houses. I'll go into how they operated on an operational level and how they utilized these things. I'll go into process and sex and the Omega and the history and what came with the process afterwards. This series of podcasts is not just some little... This is not me being a dilettante looking into this. This is... I'm going in depth because I've wanted to talk about this for a very, very long time. It is an absolute passion project. The only reason I had any interest in the ONA, the Order of Nine Angles, is because it reminded me of the process to some extent. And they refused to answer me on if they had any involvement in these two groups would have had to overlap at some point because they were running in the same circles at the same times. However, I do not have any evidence of the ONA existing until the 1970s with handwritten materials, emanations of, I can't pronounce it, and a very, very important book by Anton Long and also Naos. Though the Order of Nine Angles back then, especially, was not a cult. It was a ceremonial magic and a secret occult society. But yeah, the process to really understand how they operated, I had to go into some of the Scientology tactics. And that's why I told my Scientology story. Because understanding the basic psychoanalytical and also intelligence interrogation techniques utilized and the intelligence services influence on these groups, then you start to understand how they utilize people and how they got people in. And now that you understand the foundation, a name that the process used to do as a rebranding of themselves I believe, after this Son of Sam killings, I felt it very important to go into how cults recruit, and especially Scientology. And I don't like to utilize sources that are third hand. So if I have a first hand source I can go to, or a second hand, and in this case with Scientology and how they operate, I had me. But yeah, they you have to respect the process for really fighting against the grey forces, the mediocrity, which is destroying everything in our contemporary time. So anything that opposes the perpetuation of the grey forces, to me, is something that has value to look into. So thank you for listening, and I will have another episode up very soon. I'm going back through all Processian material and also sociological books written about the process during the 60s and 70s that I managed to get a hold of for the first time recently, which I'm very happy about. And also books by ex-Processian members like Timothy Wiley. And this is going to go more in depth than anyone that I know about has gone from an outsider perspective. So thank you for listening, and I appreciate all the interest and support in this passion project of mine, and I look forward to the next one, which, now that this is out of the way, can go more in depth into how the process operated and what they believed and why their techniques are so powerful. And of course, the more sensational elements of how are they connected to everything and everyone in the 60s and 70s in the counterculture movements. Sympathy for the Devil, the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger. I wonder who was the inspiration for that. Take care. IA.